welcome back to Story Impact. I'm your host, Lisa Towles. We all know the power of a great narrative. On this show, we focus on the master visionaries who bring those narratives to life. This series is really my way of giving authors a powerful platform, a voice that helps connect their stories and unique vision directly with readers. These conversations dig deep. We look past the finished pages to explore what's truly at the core, the creator's process, their deepest inspirations, and the unstoppable purpose that fuels their work. In addition to the series, I'm also a crime novelist, and you can read about my latest crime thrillers on Amazon and on lisatowles.com. My guest today is Martyn Burke, a storyteller who has spent 5 decades wielding novels, documentaries, and films, not as separate careers, but adjacent mediums that ask the same question: how does truth survive in the context of power? Martyn Burke began by paying his own way to Vietnam as a young war correspondent. Since then, he sat across from Idi Amin, gone undercover to investigate the KGB and the Mafia, created the definitive film about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and made the Oscar shortlisted documentary Under Fire: Journalists in Combat. His work has won Peabody Awards, Emmy nominations, and the trust of people who have lived what he documents. Now, in his latest novel, can't wait to talk about this, the Gossip Columnist, that just came out this week. It takes place in 1930s Berlin, where a young woman weaponizes gossip against Nazi propaganda, turning frivolity into a new flavor of resistance. I love that. It's a story about what we do when truth becomes dangerous, from someone who's watched that danger up close his entire career. Martyn doesn't just tell stories, he translates the chaos of power into narrative we can hold. Martyn, warmest welcome.
Thank you, Lisa.
You once said that you live 3 lives through documentaries, movies, and novels, but there's something deeper happening. You use one form to explore what another form can't reach, I think. What is it about fiction that lets you tell truths that documentary can't? And what does documentary give you that fiction never could?
Interesting question. For me, narratives have a natural form, and sometimes they are in documentaries where, for instance, I made one a few years ago about combat journalists, and I've been playing with a fictional version of that. And I find that the natural form can mutate into other forms if you adhere to a certain narrative sensibility. To make it simpler, I often use documentaries to research novels. I do it unconsciously sometimes. For instance, several years ago, I heard about all these old rhythm and blues singers who could not get paid their royalties and were starving to death or were working menial jobs when their old music, which was recorded in the 1950s, was playing all around the world. So I went to CBS and said, "Hey, I want to come in and do a few items for you on one of their shows," which I did. And I spent a lot of time in Harlem. I spent a lot of time in places like the Apollo Theater and all that. And it just turned into not only some current affairs items that were aired on CBS, but also it turned into a novel called Ivory Joe. This happens to me over and over. I never plan strategically. I'm going to start with a documentary and then go to a novel or then go to a feature. It just happens organically. I can't give you any more specific answer than that, but that's just the way it works with me.
I love that. And I have kind of found that too sometimes, where you have kind of the initial idea for something and it kind of like paves its own way once you kind of, sort of put ink to page. It's like it decides, no, we're not going to be this. We're taking you in another direction and like dragging you along for the ride. And I mean, I think that's a great adventure.
It is a wonderful adventure. It happens sometimes with characters when you're writing a character and some character demands that something happen that you hadn't planned or
Mhm.
something is said you hadn't planned. It just is one of those things which, if you analyze it minutely, you'll come to a dead end because it's part of the unconscious, the great unconscious wave that is sweeping through all of us. And some of us are lucky to be able to express it in books or films.
I wish we could spend a whole hour talking about creativity, but I have so much I want to ask you because your breadth of work is so vast. I mean, you've been in rooms with tyrants, witnessed propaganda machines up close. Now you've written about a woman preserving truth through gossip in Nazi Germany. What have you come to understand about the weight of truth in a society?
Well, for me, what got me interested in doing the Gossip Columnist was having traveled the world and seen a lot of really repressive societies, of which Nazi Germany, which obviously I didn't see, but it would be at the top of that list. There is a space between what the regime wants people to believe and what really happened. That space is where gossip exists. And gossip, which is far more in those societies than just the Hollywood nonsense we see nowadays here, it is where the real truth exists. And when I was over in Germany, I was fascinated by hearing about how gossip columnists and reporters in the early days of the Nazis suddenly had to change their tune. And I came up with a young woman, stories of a young woman who gets a job for Wielded Zeitung, the big New York Times of Berlin. It was the big newspaper. And she gets a job she doesn't really want because she thought she would get something far more substantial. But she ends up going to all these embassy parties and balls and these all these functions, and she sees all the pomposity, all the stupidness, all the craziness of these functions, and she writes about them in a very kind of cutting, funny way. Well, that goes along just fine until the Nazis take over. And once the Nazis take over, especially Joseph Goebbels, who was his official title, he was one of the top Nazis. His title is fascinating. He was called the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And how is that for a title? You don't get that very often. So he controlled everything, and he was vicious. If somebody stepped on a line, they reporters were routinely beaten to a pulp if they displeased the Nazis. So the young woman in this book has to flee for her life. She flees with an editor of the paper who becomes her lover, and they go to a brothel where they hide out in the depths of Berlin, the most impoverished, uh, poorest areas of Berlin, where they hide. And they put out word of mouth gossip, which drove the which drove the Nazis crazy. Because you have to remember, these regimes, their view of truth has them as being very imposing people. But inevitably, a lot of these people who are at the top of these regimes are like a lot of people. They're fools. A lot of them, they're very pompous. They have all sorts of failings and flaws and stupidities. Expose those, and you do so at your peril. You can have horrible things happen to you, which is the basis of the book. Um, and basically, truth for the regimes is never what really happened. It's what they want you to believe happened. And that is where people like Bella, the young gossip columnist, has to attack.
Mm. Wow, the power of words and the power of how you spin them too. I mean, like looking at your journalism background, I mean, like the truth of anything in a way is how that anything is kind of framed by the media. I mean, like I honestly I think like our brains are lazy. I mean, like we'll take just kind of like the headline and say, "Oh, okay, that's what's happening," without like digging beneath the surface to understand like separate truth from fabrication. And I mean that power, it's amazing.
Our brains are very lazy, especially in societies like ours, where there's no penalty, there's no cost, at least that we understand at the moment, to being lazy. But to give an example of how we are manipulated here in this society, I was once doing a film and I went to a big company, a quote unquote public relations company, which was a kind of a misnomer because they were an information molding company. It was in New York City in an old building around Soho or one of those places, Tribeca, one of the places in Lower Manhattan. And they had 6 or 7 floors. And on one floor, they were training business executives in what to do if all of a sudden 60 Minutes walks in the door with an expose on your company. How do you finesse it? How do you lie? On
Mhm.
the second floor, they had how to create events, how to create events that would make you look like a hero. On the third floor, there was what to do if your company has a horrible thing happen and you kill a bunch of people through some negligence. How do you spin that? Floor after floor after floor. Each one of these was how do you mold the truth? Now, that happens all the time here in our society right now. But when you get to a society where the tipping point falls into Nazism, for instance, then the price you pay is really, really high. To try and expose those falsehoods, you risk your life. And that is one of the things that I think we all need to guard against.
So true. Um, let's talk about Under Fire. In Under Fire, you explored kind of what you've been talking about, how journalists carry the psychological weight of what they witness. You know, thinking about that word power, systems of power, abuses of power, how do you think that changes the role and impact of stories? And how do you think it changes it for the impact of stories right now at this point in time?
Well, there's a couple of elements to answer that question. The first thing about that documentary Under Fire, it was a feature documentary we did, and it was basically subtitled The Psychological Cost of Covering Wars, which, if you are one of the people, I have been in a couple of wars. I've been in combat situations in a couple of wars. I've seen innumerable riots and insurrections and all that stuff. And I never wanted to do that for a living. I never expected that that would be my life. But there are people who do that for a living. And after a while, the psychological cost of that, it is, you talk about PTSD, everybody seems to throw that around these days, but these people suffer from that horrendously. But in terms of the overall society, um, we have to remember that the images we get can be molded in any number of ways. They can be molded by agendas. And I really think it's important to try and understand if there is an agenda of somebody who is thrusting the news at us. Because there are so many ways to mold it. I'll give you just one small example. You can have a protest demonstration and you can do a close-up which shows 50 people. When I say close up, I'm not talking about a real close up. You can have a shot that shows 50 people, and you can stand there and say a huge demonstration happened, and it looks like you're there in a huge demonstration.
Mm-hmm.
You have a very wide shot, and you'd look like an idiot for saying that because it would be a nothing demonstration. There'd be hardly anybody there.
Yeah.
You can manipulate what you want people to see and believe in so many ways. You know, everything from camera angles to choice of lenses and on and on. And obviously you can leave out facts, you can put in facts, but the news is constantly being shaped and molded. And I think that part of the gossip columnist is to show the price of people not paying attention to that or not being able to fight against that, which is what happens to the young woman in this novel. She, as I said, has to flee for her life.
Wow. You've created intimate portraits of world leaders, of figures like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Pirates of Silicon Valley. You sat across from Idi Amin. Whether it's genius or monstrosity, again, I keep coming back to that word power. In this type of storytelling, how do you think you as an artist were or are shaped by these personalities that you're translating, that you're listening to, that you're growing close to, and that you're writing about?
I guess the only thing you can try and do is to make yourself, myself in those cases, as invisible as possible so that the person, let's say Idi Amin or whomever, is coming right through to the audience, and I'm not there interfering with that process. I'm not making myself so visible. I am there to try and make sure that if I'm doing a feature drama, like a film like I did on Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, that I am not interposing myself in that case as the film director by trying to be so artistic, so over the top, that I get in the way of what George Orwell called prose should be as clear as a window pane. You have to be able to see right through. And that would be the case of people you are portraying, like in documentaries. And again, I've been with all kinds of leaders and spies and good people and bad people. You just try to get out of the way so that it is a direct line from the person you're portraying to the person watching.
Where would you say you feel the most like you, like your essential self? Would that be on a busy film set, in the solitude of your writing studio?
That would be as an author. I mean, it is one of, as I'm sure you understand, it's one of the last bastions where it's just you and what you want to do. Now, as you go on, you may have to edit it and change it and something, but for the moment, it's you with your characters. I love certain parts of a film set because, for instance, one of the magical things is if you've written something and you see it some way and an actor comes along and gives it a totally different spin that you'd never seen before, and it's magical. That is a beautiful moment. And it has its analogies in things like when you're writing and you start off thinking you're going from A to C, and suddenly you find yourself at M, N, or L. And how did I get here? If it works properly, it's magic. But again, the word is properly because you can find yourself in tangents all over the place. But those magic moments of creativity. I from the time I was a little boy, I would go off in my room and I would write. I wrote diaries, first of all. That was the first thing I did. But I love the process of writing. It is just magical. And so I'm an author who happens to stumble into films from time to time. Thankfully and gratefully, with great fun. I love it, but I am an author.
Mm, so interesting. Um, so let's talk about your writing process then. Like when and where do you write? Are you someone who needs complete silence, or do you work in noisy coffee houses, or do you have like a special place, or is it just you and your laptop in your truck and you just kind of go somewhere?
It's just me and the laptop I live in two different places. I live, as I said, in California and in Toronto, Canada.
Mhm.
And I have spaces in both those homes, and it is just me and the characters who are all around. I mean, you know this from writing. I mean, I literally, at some point, I don't want to make this too literal, but you feel like you're just recording what your characters are doing. They're in your head, of course, but they're all around you.
Mhm.
And I try and write in the mornings, take the afternoon off, come back and I like writing in the evenings too.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I used to have really rigid schedules that way, and as time has gone on, I make them slightly looser now. But I can only write for a few hours at a time, and then you get tired and you start writing mush. So you got to be careful that you don't extend that just for the sake of getting more words on a page.
Or word count. Yeah, definitely. So take a step back and look at kind of the publishing landscape as it is in 2026. I mean, there are some just tectonic changes, even really in the last like 5 years. I mean, a lot of advantages, a lot of disadvantages. As an author, what do you think is great and advantageous about the writing landscape, the publishing landscape now?
Well, first of all, I think we got to look to the biologists, first of all, to answer that question, because we are in entire shift of a whole ecology. The ecology of publishing has had one of these major shifts, and when you speak to biologists and the zoologists, they'll tell you about down through history, there were all these shifts from one era to another era. They often happen very quickly. And you can talk about the dinosaurs being wiped out. You can talk about how mankind developed, but there were all these tectonic shifts. And what they have found is that it was the most exquisitely adapted to the old order who had trouble with the new order. It was always the freaks, the nimbles, and the crazies who somehow survived and jumped into the new order.
Mhm.
And I think part of our job is to be part of the freaks, the nimbles, and the crazies because publishing, as you just said, it bears no relationship now to what I first started out in, with all the big houses, and that was all there was. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list every Sunday for the top fiction novels, you will see often, almost always, you'll see publishing houses who you've never heard of before. In the old days, it was Doubleday, it was HarperCollins, it was Penguin, it was Bantam.
Mhm.
Now, they're
Mhm.
all dinky little places that nobody's ever heard of before.
Mhm.
Uh, I think that is wonderful. I think there is this shift in the ecology of publishing that has made it much more chaotic and much more interesting stuff is coming out that you would never see before because the gatekeepers were so beholden the to whatever the literary fad du jour was or to what their idea of quality was. There's also, as we all know, there's a lot of crap coming out too. I mean, there's so much stuff coming out that it is overwhelming. But I do think rather than wringing our hands and saying, "Oh, I miss the old days where it was only six or seven major publishers," and then throw in St. Martin's just because they were there, I think it's a very interesting time now, and I quite like it.
Um, what do you know now about art that you wish you knew at the beginning of your journey as a writer, as a war correspondent, when you were kind of just sort of starting to concretize your artistic vision and tell stories?
That is a very tough question to answer because I think what I would have to say one of the lessons I learned was to be as ruthless as possible on myself and what I was working on. Um, I I used to just through sheer of never possibly doing it again, fall in love with things I had done. And I don't mean that in a vain or kind of sanctimonious way. It was more protective way. I've learned you can't protect. You have to be tough. And um, I think what I have learned is I need to look with two sets of eyes. I need to look with the exuberance of creation, of the joy of creation, and then have another set of sensibilities and eyes that is capable of saying, nah, it doesn't work. And you only get that after you have messed up big time,
Mhm.
being too easy on yourself. That is not in terms of that is not answering your question in terms of moralities or aesthetics. I think that has also evolved over time. I think I have one of the things I think you get, or you should get if you've been in this long enough, is an appreciation of the complexity of character. There is nobody who is simple. I mean, no matter what it is, people are complex. And I think you acquire, and not necessarily an understanding, but an ability to perceive those complexities as you go on.
Hmm. And maybe tolerate those complexities too. I think when I was younger, I was so judgmental. I had very rigid categories for things. That's what makes you feel smart when you're a young person, I think, and gives you this sort of illusion of understanding. But yeah, kind of like the gray areas and,
Yeah.
kind of appreciating those complexities. Yeah. Um,
Not only, not only understand them, I agree with that, but embrace them sometimes. For instance, some of the most interesting characters are the bad guys. And the bad guys have to be really interesting. And in sometimes they have to be in a scary way, interesting or approachable, or even, dare I say, likable. The reason I say this is because I have learned about the charm of evil. That's what I call certain people. And I'll give you an example. Idi Amin had what I call the charm of evil. I spent enjoyable time with him, and nobody got to him. He was murdering so many people at that time. He ran Uganda. Half his cabinet had been murdered on the week that I got there. I mean, he was a scary, scary guy. But when I was with him, he was jovial and funny and charming. And you had to tell yourself, wait a minute, I am with a person who is doing on a routine basis horrendously evil things. But you find that sometimes, and that's why some of the biggest characters in the world of evil, and I would go down through Shakespeare sometimes and keep on going. Some of them have this fascinating charm, almost attraction. I once spent time with a mafia hitman. I was doing a series about undercover stuff and sting operations on the mob.
mhm.
And I spent a time with a guy who was in witness protection. He was a major mafia hitman, and he was now living in somewhere, I think Spokane, Washington or something. He was an East Coast guy, and I got to him through all sorts of strange things. But when I met him, I spent some time with him, and for the first few hours, he was like he could have been a friend of mine. He was charming and funny.
Mm.
But two things. One was he had dead eyes. Most of these characters who have this particular charm I'm talking about, they have the smile of the face, but the eyes are dead. That was one thing. The second thing is that he was talking in such a funny, funny way, and then happened to slip in how he had to murder his best friend. And it was like, you what? You'd stop in your mind. You just come to a screeching halt and you're replaying what he's just said to you while he's going on talking, as if he's your best friend. So to get back to that would be the absolute apex of complexity, when you talk about the complexity of bad people or like evil people.
Mhm.
Some people are evil in a simplistic way, but some are evil in a charming way. And often they make the scariest uh, characters in books, films, or plays.
And most memorable, the ones that really stay with us. Like here's this complete sociopath that I find myself feeling kind of sympathetic about what he went through in his life, and that presents something that's scary. It's like, what's wrong with me that I look through that lens. Before we go, Martyn, tell me what you're if you're allowed to tell me what you're working on now. I mean, I'm sure you're working on like 10 different things. What's the one thing you're most excited about?
Well, I'm gonna finesse that answer and give you two things because I I do things on a long-term basis and I generally put things aside and they come back into life in ways that I cannot predict. Two things that come back into life. One is a feature film that I will be doing at some point, but we've hit a snag in the road until the situation in the Caribbean straightens out. It takes place in the Caribbean, and because of the chaos there right now, that is kind of on shaky grounds. But I I spent the last 4 months writing a sequel, which I've never done before, to the Gossip Columnist. It involves two of the characters from the Gossip Columnist, and it takes place in Berlin and in North America. And I've just been making a run at that. It was one of those things which I'm sure you understand. It could not be predicted. I hadn't timed it. I hadn't slotted in something. It just hit me like a bus, and
Mhm.
I could not ignore it. So it took over my life, and
Love it.
gloriously so.
I love when that happens. I mean, like then you become the vessel and you're like, okay, let me just get a pen, sure, and like off you go. And I think that's so fun. Well, it's just been so delightful talking to you, Martyn. Thank you so much for joining me today. And the Gossip Columnist is out and it's available. And I will put your website in the comments. And thank you again. And viewers, we will see you next time.
Okay, thank you, Lisa.